All right, this is part one of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Today we're looking at the why. Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? So let's get a little bit of backstory going on here with Japan. For more than about 2 centuries, Japan had avoided almost all contact with Europeans and Americans. So they did not participate in the age of imperialism. This goes back to the scramble for Africa. And if you happen to have your IMBs at home, you can look that up in your interactive notebooks. But if you do, you will see that we did not have Japan on that map for coming in and taking over parts of Africa. So there was a standoff in the mid 1800s with a U.S. Navy Commodore, Matthew C. Perry, where he comes in and he lines up some Navy ships of the United States pointing their guns towards Japan. Japan realizes at this time that they cannot beat a powerful modern nation like the United States of America. So this sparks a time of a convention at Kanagawa, and the treaty there that was signed opened up Japanese ports to trade with the United States. So this also opens a path of trade with Japan, with other European countries such as Great Britain, Russia, France, and the Netherlands. And as we know, trade is a good thing for an economy, and Japan starts becoming more industrialized and modern. Japan is a series of islands. And so if you think about geography and what you've learned about geography over the years, that means they're going to have limited resources, limited land, limited space. And so to be able to trade for natural resources was definitely, a plus, a boom for their economy. And so this helps them to become more industrialized and modern. So as they start to do this, well, ta-da, they do start a policy of imperialism. So in the late 1800s, give you a little timeline here. So they go to war with China. A year later, they invade Korea and the island of Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan. Over the next 4 decades, they take lands that belong to China, Russia, and Germany. 1931, they invade Manchuria. 1937, they start an all-out war to take over China. But 2 years into that, the war is at a stalemate. And if you remember from World War I, then that means that, no side is obviously winning. So by 1939, it's at a stalemate. You've done the invasion of Poland, which is the official start of World War II. So that was also in 1939. So not only do you have Japan already at war with China, you've got the Second World War has started at this time period also. So it's just good to know the United States is not involved in World War II at this point. It has started, but we are still following a policy of isolationism like we did in World War I and trying to stay neutral. We're across the ocean, so we're trying not to participate in this war. So at first, with everything that's going on with Japan and then their invasions and the war with China, at first, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States at the time, he tries diplomacy to force a resolution. So he threatens to cut American trade with Japan if it doesn't withdraw from China. And in 1940, he stations the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, as a further warning to Japan, because it's in Hawaii, it's close to Japan, much closer than, anywhere else for the United States. So this is another warning that, hey, we're aware of what you're doing. We're not happy with it. So you need to stop. Japan doesn't stop. And so in July of that same year, Roosevelt signs an act that restricts the sale of essential defense materials to Japan. So we're looking at the third bullet here. So some of the essential materials that Japan was getting from the United States: oil, steel, scrap iron, and aviation fuel, so fuel for their planes. President Roosevelt says, nope, we're not selling these things to you anymore. And thinking that would also stop Japan and their policy of imperialism. but the Japanese did not stop. So by August of 1940, while most of Europe was embattled in World War II, Japanese troops occupied the northern part of French Indochina. And in September, they signed a treaty of cooperation with Germany and Italy. So they're at war. So Japan signs a treaty of cooperation with them, basically saying, we're not going to get involved. We're doing our own thing. So they do form this alliance. They become known as the Axis powers for World War II. So Japan is trying to do its own thing and gain as much control as they can while Germany and Italy are at war on the actual continent of Europe. Japan's doing its thing in the Pacific Ocean. So Roosevelt orders this freeze on selling anything to Japan or buying anything also from Japan. So Japan has a few natural resources of its own, but without the oil, gasoline, and other raw materials from the United States, its Army and Navy could not produce the materials they needed for fighting. So now we're kind of at this fourth bullet here. By the fall of 1941, Japanese military government led by Hideaki Toho, they face a little dilemma, a question. So if they withdraw and listen to the demands of America, well, then America will start trading with them again. If they refuse, then the U.S. trade embargo would remain in place, and they would have to find a new source for their oil and their aviation fuel. Japan believes that seizing new territories in the Indian and Pacific Oceans was the answer to their problems. So the military leader and his advisors, they knew that the United States would have an advantage over Japan in a long, drawn-out war. And so their idea was that if they could attack and cut us off from coming into a long, drawn-out war, then they would win. So we had more people, we had more money, we had more factories to manufacture weapons and war supplies. But in 1941, the Japanese military believed that they had the advantage. They had a large modern navy and an army hardened by years of combat with China. The United States was also already deeply involved in trying to help the British in the war against Germany, which they'd been fighting since September of 1939. So, with the United States closely watching and distracted by the situation in Europe, Japan hoped that a series of quick attacks and victories would force a peace and leave Japan in control of Eastern Asia and that part of the Pacific Ocean. All right, so while the Japanese prepare for war, the Toho government continued negotiating with the United States. Perhaps that government hoped that Roosevelt might change his mind and resume trade with Japan, or maybe it believed that as long as the negotiations continued, the U.S. government would not suspect that Japan secretly was planning an attack. So, feeling like the talks were failing with Japan, the U.S. military leaders warned Roosevelt that their forces would not be ready for war until the spring of 1942. Still, the U.S. Army and Navy rushed to reinforce Hawaii and the Philippine Islands, the U.S. territories that are closest to Japan in the Pacific Ocean. On December 1st, 1941, the Japanese government, with the consent of their Emperor Hirohito, secretly decide to end negotiations and attack the U.S. forces on December 8th, which is December 7th because of the time zone in the United States. American leaders suspected that Japan was about to strike. U.S. intelligence officials had broken the Japanese diplomatic code back in July, and they had intercepted a message from Tokyo to the Japanese ambassador in the United States on December 6th. But they did not know that the naval force at Hawaii's Pearl Harbor would be the target. So Japan does come, and they do attack Pearl Harbor. So we have our answer to the why. The why is the trade embargo. The why is that they were being imperialistic and they wanted more lands, they wanted more resources, they wanted pretty much to control that area of the Pacific Ocean and that part of Asia. And so they felt like that by attacking the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, that would really hurt the United States, that would hurt our Navy, and that would hurt our chances at any kind of a long, drawn out war with Japan. So there's our why. Your question is, what do you think is going to happen? So what's going to be the effect of this attack on Pearl Harbor? What do you think is going to happen? Some of you may know what's going to happen because you're history buffs. Some of you are going to wait on part 2 of what do you think is going to happen. But I'd like for you to submit your answer to what you think is going to happen any way you choose, like you've already been doing. So you can go back through this presentation, and I want you to do some critical thinking about what you know about wars. And they have devastated the United States Navy base in Hawaii. So what do you think is going to happen now that Japan has attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor?